Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
I will set up the sharing so that you can um, share your posts and slides.
Okay, tell me if you could see them.
Yeah, I can see them.
Okay, and while I'm at it, I want to add pointer. Hmm. Shape. That will work. Can you, I'm just trying to set up a pointer here. Looking at there's a couple different options now. This is pen, vanishing pen, highlighter, smart pen. No, I'll just do pen. Actually, no, I'll just do shape. No, that's not working. Hmm. No, I don't want to draw.
This is through PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's not what I'm trying to do. Let me just close that off and try again. Usually at the bottom, it looks like they've changed things a bit. Oh, there it is. Sorry, I'm just trying to look for. Yes, there it is. Can you see the laser pointer
Yeah,
now?
I can.
Oh, yeah.
You did
Good.
gain like a green circle in the middle there, but
Yeah, I know. I'll get rid of that. Okay. So
I don't know what
pages.
number I last updated you with, or if I have updated you with, but we have 154 registrations for today.
Wow.
Yeah, so we got a lot of interested
I
participants.
suspect though, it is taped, right? So I suspect
Yes.
people will sign in when they have time and look at it after the fact and
Yeah,
call you.
well, a lot of this is also because and this is where I will be speaking kind of for the end, is it does qualify as a nitrogen management knowledge sharing event for those who have an off-calf project. So
Okay.
that brings a lot of people because we do have about 400 projects of those who need to complete their knowledge sharing event.
I
So,
see. So this is
yeah.
a check off box.
A checkoff box, but it's also brings an opportunity for farmers to learn something new, right?
Okay.
Kelly, I was just saying we're at 154 registrations.
Yeah, sorry I was late. I've had a few people emailing me they couldn't get in, so I was putting out a few fires. Hi, Craig.
Hello, how are you?
Good, good, good. It's nice to see you. How's your summer going?
Oh, really good.
Yeah, good. That's great. Do we want to just to test our slides or
We did.
you did already? Okay, because
Yeah.
I have slides for the intro and stuff, so maybe I
Sure. Yeah, go
will.
right ahead.
Okay. Sorry, just give me one sec. All kinds of little messages up there. You see that?
In just a moment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Let me I'd like to put it though, I'm going to put it in full screen. That better?
Yeah.
Yep. That looks
Okay.
good.
Okay.
Did you want to keep
Perfect.
that like open there so it's kind of
Sure.
if you're the first thing? Yeah, my end of the role is and you can mention this, Kelly, is that at the end I will share a QR code for participants.
Okay. I'm also going to mention that this is being approved for crop advisors.
Okay,
We're just to have people email us and then they will put them in the database. They
perfect.
haven't finalized it yet. So I'm going to give them the research at ontariosoilcrop.org. But if, yeah, you want to mention that at the end as well, that would be great, Anastasia.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Your last name, just to make sure I'm pronouncing it properly, is Lagunova. Does that sound
Lagunova.
right?
Yeah.
Okay. I practiced it a few times this morning. I'm like, oh, I don't think I've actually ever said Anastasia's last name.
I mean, I would avoid it. I avoid it. Very Russian name.
Okay. That's nice. All right. Oh, that's good. 150 people. That's great. Lots of people are getting on, and I'm sure everybody would like to get out of the heat. This is a great way to spend their lunch hour. Perfect.
Yeah, it's approaching 40 Humidex here, so
I know.
Yeah.
I know. It's awful.
Where are you based out of, Craig?
well, I'm actually out of Harrow, so that's just south of Windsor,
Right.
if that means anything to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think what I'm going to do is I have a few slides. I'll take people through sort of the Living Lab overview, and then I will introduce you both, and then I will put my mic on mute, and I will monitor the chat. If there's any questions, I'll send them directly to you, Anastasia. Okay, and because you're going to moderate the rest of it, right?
Yeah, Craig,
As it
what
goes.
kind of method would you prefer? Would you prefer all questions at the end? If there's any questions in between?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, if there's something that's burning, perhaps, but I guess my concern is if we stop for a lot of questions, the thing may go way too
Yeah.
long, and
Yeah. Yeah.
It'll
be nice.
sidetracked.
And I find
Yeah.
it takes those online quite a bit, like some time to get comfortable with asking questions too. You know, like start with one or
Well-
two, and then you get like 10 coming through suddenly.
And the other aspect is that oftentimes the questions I'm asked, I will actually cover that question later on the talk. So you end
Yeah.
up by repeating things that way.
Sounds good.
I am flexible, but I feel it generally goes better when the questions are left at the end, but
Mhm.
your call.
How long's your presentation, Craig?
My guess, okay, so probably around 45 minutes.
Okay.
Well, between 45 minutes and an hour, but certainly no longer than an hour.
Okay. Perfect. Then
I
after
think
this, sorry?
I think was it 45 minutes I was sort of aiming for, or
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
We
should be
booked it for an
quicker.
hour.
Yeah.
We have a little bit of lead time if it goes over a little bit, but we're going to try to
Yeah.
keep it
No,
to an
that
hour
would be
now.
fine. I'm
Okay.
pretty sure I can make it there. I think the hour is more if there were questions.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Sorry, I missed that. The presentation is how long?
It'll be probably between around 45 minutes.
Okay. Perfect.
And
Yeah,
we're
I always
recording.
leave lead time, but I feel like it'll be a definitely the hour will be fulfilled.
Mm-hmm. And we're recording, right? Yeah, broadcast.
Yeah, it's recording right
Okay.
now.
Okay. That's great. Once you get through this, Craig, I'm going to start bugging you about my video again.
Oh, okay.
Sure you're busy, but we'll try to
Yeah,
figure something else.
It's been a pretty hectic between field work and anyways.
Weather,
You know what's like?
sure. Mm-hmm. I know. I've been trying to contact a lot of people through the month of June. People just don't want to hear from me right now. So that's fine.
Yeah.
Well, field season's well underway now. At least
Yeah,
that's
good.
one thing today.
Good. Yeah, I had my whole garden in early, I think the 10th of May, and then the rain came and it was like, oh, it's not good. And now we're sort of in a drought here in the Kawartha Lakes. We haven't had any rain at all. Keeps going around us.
Oh, we're just inundated. We had probably about 3 inches over the last week, and Yeah,
Wow.
we just got planted and side dressed last Tuesday, and then it hasn't really stopped raining.
Wow.
So it's been a good year to test nitrification inhibitors, anyways.
Right. That's good. Yeah, we keep hoping it's going to come our way, but it seems to just go right around us. It's terrible.
Yeah, you could have some of ours. Where are you located?
We're in Omemee, so between Peterborough and Lindsay. And
Oh, okay.
yeah, we do rotational grazing here.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
was gonna say Guelph keeps getting the rain too.
Mm.
funny. How are we doing for people in the waiting room, Anastasia?
We have over 50 in the waiting room.
Fantastic.
About 10 registrations since this morning, since I checked.
Yeah, I put 4 of those in. Okay.
Oh, we do have someone from OMAFA on the call today too.
Good.
And then I believe I saw OFA as well.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, a bit surprising actually with how busy people have been in June. There have time for a
Yeah,
webinar.
the
That is
last
fantastic.
nitrogen management knowledge sharing event I moderated, we had like 77 on the call. It was a good attendance.
Good.
Yeah, looks like you're close to that now. 69 showing up.
Yeah.
Good. Well, we'll wait. What time do you want to open the
I can
door?
open as soon as it turns 12.
Okay.
And then,
We'll start right away.
yeah, I would give like 30 seconds because it takes a while but to like load everyone in. So I would
Sure.
give about 30 seconds and then start up.
Sounds good.
12 now, so
Perfect. See how fast we go over 100. All right. I will mute myself and I'll start the webinar then.
Okay, that's great.
I'll mute myself as well.
Hi, folks. We'll just wait one more minute or 30 seconds to make sure everybody is in the meeting. Thank you very much for attending today. Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm sure you're all glad to have a little bit of break from the heat for this great webinar that we are presenting today. I am Kelly Carmichael. I am the Knowledge Mobilization Specialist with the Living Lab Ontario program in the OSCIA Research Department. I will start with giving you a little overview of Living Labs. I'll introduce our speakers and then I will hand it off and we can enjoy this great presentation by Craig Jury. Living Labs is a national program. There are currently 14 Living Labs across Canada. It's a farmer and researcher collaborating on innovations to improve carbon sequestration, reducing GHG emissions, and environmental co-benefits. And the three pillars of the Living Lab program is user-centric innovation, working in partnership, and real-life context. So we work with our partners, farmers and researchers, working to develop and test innovative, beneficial management practices. There are over 50 living labs in Ontario right now, with studying a variety of beneficial management practices. And those range from cover crops, organic amendments, GHG and carbon sequestration, nitrogen management, profit mapping, water quality, and pollinator habitat restoration. I'd also like to give a shout out to our funding partners and the organizations that we work with across Ontario to bring living labs to the farm, and also to yourselves through a variety of different outreach strategies. And if you want to know more about Living Lab, you can find out more on the OSCIA website. And that's about it for my little presentation here. I'll go back to this, where we have a picture of Dr. Craig Drury out on the field delivering some information about nitrogen management. And the overview for his presentation today: nitrogen management strategies to increase nitrogen availability to crops. When nitrogen fertilizer is added to soil, it undergoes enzymatic, sorry, I get that word, microbial reactions, and some of these processes can result in losses of a very expensive fertilizer input. Craig Drury's presentation will provide examples of different approaches that could be used to help your farm operation reduce these losses and increase the amount of nitrogen available to your crops. Dr. Craig Drury is a soil biochemist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada at the Harrow Research and Development Centre in Ontario. He obtained his Bachelor's of Science and Master's of Science from McGill University and his PhD in soil science from the University of Guelph. Craig's primary research focus is to develop soil and crop management practices to reduce nitrogen losses from agricultural soils, while enhancing soil health and crop yields. Craig has served as editor for the Canadian Journal of Soil Science, an associate editor for the Soil Science Society of American Journal, and he served on the North American Proficiency and Testing Program Oversight Committee. Craig is a fellow and past president of the Canadian Society of Soil Science, and he has published 267 peer-reviewed papers on the subject. So we're very lucky to have him here with us today. To moderate this presentation, Craig will be joined by Anastasia Laganova, who is the Knowledge Mobilization Specialist for the OFCAF program. The On-Farm Climate Action Fund, OFCAF, provides cost-sharing funding to farmers to support the implementation of best management practices to tackle climate change through reducing emissions of GHGs and supporting increased carbon sequestration. I would also, before I turn it over to them, like to tell anybody who is a crop advisor or looking for credits for your CEU, this presentation is being approved for CEU credits. Please send me an email at research@ontariosoilcrop.org to have your credits counted, and we will make sure that happens. Okay, I would like to turn this over to Craig and Anastasia. Looking forward to the presentation. Thank you.
I can make a quick mention that all questions can be sent through the chat in the Q&A, and we will go through the questions at the end of Craig's presentation. And at the end of the presentation and questions, I will present a QR code for those who are looking for a knowledge sharing event credit for today's presentation. I'll leave it to Craig.
Okay. Can you see my slides? And it's in presentation mode? Good. So welcome. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you and hopefully get out of the heat. I don't know about you, but we're approaching 40 centigrade where I am in southwestern Ontario, and I guess this wave is probably affecting all of us. And I appreciate the opportunity to take the time out to look at some of the information I'm going to be sharing. So, as was mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on some nitrogen management strategies with the purpose of trying to reduce losses and increase nitrogen availability to crops. I will be presenting not just living lab work, but some of the research studies that really were the basis for our choice of some of the living lab studies. I've been working on this for a number of years and had many collaborators help me with this research. So I'd like to acknowledge some of the other scientists that have participated, including Laurie Phillips, microbiologist at Harrow, Dan Reynolds, Shuming Yang, and Ward Smith. So let's just, okay. So overall, if I look at research I've been conducting, especially over the last 10 or 15 years, trying to develop nitrogen management strategies which reduce fertilizer nitrogen losses and enhancing crop yields. Government of Canada is trying to reduce N2O emissions from fertilizers by 30% by 2030. Also looking at programs to increase carbon storage in soils to promote soil health, yield sustainability, and ultimately to try to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So those are the overreaching goals of not just my research, but many of the researchers in university and government labs over the country. I'm not going to spend very much time on this graph, but basically I'm trying to illustrate here that this is the nitrogen cycle. And the nitrogen cycle is so complicated. There's so many different pathways going on. There's, as I mentioned in the overview, there's enzymatic reactions that are occurring, like when you add urea or UAN fertilizer, the urea is converted to ammonium. The problem is that a lot of these reactions can also result in losses. So as an example, this circle up here is ammonium volatilization. Some of the ammonium will stay in the soil and be available to plants, but when urea hydrolyzes or UAN hydrolyzes, pH can go up, and the higher the pH, the more that can come off as a gas. If it comes off as gas, it's not going to be available to your crops, unfortunately. So without going into each of these circles, the point here is if you look at all those circles that are in red, those represent losses of nitrogen out of the soil, right? And so the objective, for farmers, for researchers, is to try to reduce a lot of these losses and really focus in on this green circle, and which is really trying to enhance the amount of nitrogen that's going into crops. So without going through every single step of this and bore you, I have come up with a different approach that use to try to illustrate what we're trying to achieve here. For those of you who have seen it, maybe this is before, it'll take me 2 minutes to go through it, time to microwave your coffee. For those that are still there, if you can imagine sort of the nitrogen cycle as basically a pipe with various valves. And those are sort of opportunities, unfortunately, for nitrogen to be lost in the soil. So as an example, let's take an example of urea added to soil. So it sort of starts the process. And the first thing that occurs is urea hydrolyzes to ammonium, NH4+, which is in the soil and can be used by plants. But unfortunately, as you see in this diagram, if the pH goes up, if it's surface applied, we can lose quite a bit of ammonium. And I'll show you actual results of ammonium loss that could be as much as 50% of the N that's applied. Later on, after the ammonium is what is left of the nitrogen in the soil, it can undergo another process called nitrification, and the ammonium is converted to nitrate, and that goes along the pipe. Now, when we have a lot of rain, the soil becomes very wet. And microbes in the soil can convert some of this nitrate, and we can have other losses, whether it's nitric oxide, N2O, which is the one that is of concern from a climate perspective, because the N2O does end up by going into the stratosphere and deplete the ozone layer. So we really want to decrease that. Not only is it a loss of expensive nutrient, but it also can harm the environment. And we can also have some N2 loss, which is inert. 80% of the air we breathe is N2, but again, it represents a loss of a fertilizer. Furthermore, nitrate is soluble in water. So if you have leaching occur in a lot of rain, nitrate can be lost below the crop root zone. So at the end of the day, the nitrogen available to this plant at the very end occurs, all the losses have occurred, and it's only what's left over really that the plant can use. So if we take that approach and now we try to look at the 4 R's. So I'm just going to give you an example of one practice and to show you what might occur. So one practice might be to add a nitrification inhibitor. So that sort of slows down the conversion of ammonium to nitrate. And in fact, if you compare it to our original slide here with the N2O, we can have lower N2O emissions. So it has achieved its goal. The catch is if you leave the nitrogen and the ammonium longer and the pH is higher, we actually might get higher ammonium loss compared to our sort of first scenario where you're really not incorporating any for our practice. So it's really pollution swapping. We've decreased one loss of N2O, but we've increased ammonium. At the end of the day, the plant isn't really growing anymore, or the yields haven't increased. All we've done is switched one form of nitrogen loss to another. Another approach is because ammonium can be so high and represent a huge loss as far as the nitrogen fertilizer is concerned. The other valve is like adding a practice, and it could be a urease inhibitor or incorporating the nitrogen in the soil. And indeed, we can decrease a lot of ammonium, so there's more nitrogen in the soil. However, as you can see, compared to the starting point, we have increased the amount of N2O and N2 loss. However, since ammonium loss is so high, and I said up to 50%, we still may have higher yields, even though we have higher N2O emissions. Now, lastly, if you can try to add a couple of practices together, so it could be adding a dual inhibitor. It could be conservation agriculture practice, and I'll show you how those are effective, whether it's conservation tillage, cover crops, and so forth. But by adding a couple practices, as an example, now we're injecting UAN, so ammonium loss is lower. You might have a dual inhibitor. So we can actually achieve much lower losses with the idea that more goes into the plant. Now, this is just a concept. It's just to make it easier to illustrate, how this works, where the soil is like a pipe where there's a lot of openings, and we're trying to use 4R practices to decrease some of these losses. So really, what can we do to reduce some of these losses? And then you have to look at nutrient stewardship, the 4R principles. So we can look at enhanced end sources. So adding a urease and nitrification inhibitor with your urea fertilizer or adding it to your UAN tank. We can look at the timing of application, trying to apply nitrogen more when the crop needs it, targeting the placement, maybe targeting more the crop root zone by injecting or banding. Then lastly, if you can reduce some of the losses with better sources, better timing, better placement, maybe you can back off on your N rates because you've reduced losses and you may not need quite as much fertilizer. Lastly, I think we can't really look at fertilizer in isolation from soil health. Anything that we can do to increase soil health, to increase carbon, improve structure also reduces losses. So again, just to reaffirm that things like cover crops, crop rotation, conservation tillage, they can all enhance soil carbon, soil health, and can also be beneficial. Now, I'm going to be talking about really all these factors in my talk. I'm going to give you various examples. In terms of nitrogen fertilizer placement, I've done studies that we compare broadcast urea, broadcasting the urea, incorporating the soil, or injecting UAN or streaming UAN. So there's, just placement alone, there's four different options, just or four different main options that could be considered. In terms of enhanced efficiency end sources, well, we could just add the straight fertilizer, so it'd be none, urea or UAN, or we can add it with either a urease inhibitor alone, a nitrification inhibitor alone, or a combined inhibitor, and that will be the one I'll be recommending, as you'll see from some of the slides. But again, there's four different options just alone there. If you add a ESN or soil release fertilizer, that's sort of a fifth. Planting, well, you could apply it all at once at planting, or you can have some at planting and some at side dress, or even some at the V10 to V3. So there's, multiple options there. And again, if you can, in fact, reduce losses through better placement, higher efficiencies and sources and timing, then you might be able to back off in your rate. Maybe even look at a 85% N rate. So there's multiple options. So I've had to design my research studies over the years. And if you look at all the different combinations I could look at, if there's four options of placement, four different types of end sources, that's 16, three different timing, that's 48, look at different N rates. There's so many different treatments that I cannot look at all the treatments in any one study. There's just too many plots, too many samples. I would need to hire a whole, school worth of summer students to do all these options. So unfortunately, I've had to do them sort of 2 or 3 factors at a time with a limited number of treatments, but I try to build on it, as you can see in the next few slides. So when I first started back on this particular topic, which was 2013, I took a fairly simple comparison. I was looking at just either, and this is sort of phase 1 of the research. I'm currently in phase 5. But when I first looked at it was comparing broadcast urea to injected UAN. Then I wanted to look at different, either just regular fertilizer or the regular fertilizer with urease and nitrification inhibitor. Fairly simple, 2 different placements, 2 different end sources. So if we look at the nitrogen sources and placement, here the 2 placements, so broadcast versus injection. So I was broadcasting urea, or Super U, which is urea plus a urease and nitrification inhibitor. And the second one was injecting, usually inject liquid UAN, and then with the same 2 inhibitors, urease and nitrification inhibitor, which happen to be Accutane plus. So if we look at this as ammonium losses, so I set up wind tunnels in the field to measure losses. If I look at ammonium losses, here we applied about 150 kilograms of N, and we've lost 40 kilograms, sort of a quarter, over a matter of 2 weeks after application. All we did was add the dual inhibitor. We were able to decrease those losses by, significantly, by about 75%. So we've gone from 40, down to about 10. If we inject alone, even without inhibitor, we're down to 10. Or inject with the dual inhibitor, we've eliminated loss. So if we eliminated loss, that additional 40 kilograms that was lost with broadcast urea is now left in the soil and available to plants. So what happened with yields? Here we could see broadcast, our yields were, fairly low during that time period, low 170s. We had a 5% yield increase if we had a urease or a dual inhibitor. Just adding the same amount of nitrogen, but injecting in the soil, we had a 10% yield increase. And injecting with either a urease inhibitor or dual inhibitor in this particular study, an 18% yield increase. That clearly pays for itself because we're having, over 30 bushel per acre increase, if it's, even $6 a bushel, that's $180 additional profit. You subtract off the $20 for the dual inhibitor, and that's money in your pocket. So, okay, so we looked at, something very simple, two placements. They were side dress, but I guess the question came up next is, what happens if you apply it all at planting with these inhibitors? Could you, make it easy and get that over with compared to side dress? In this particular study, now I wanted to separate out. The first study I used a urease and nitrication inhibitor. This one I want to compare no inhibitors, just a urease inhibitor or this dual inhibitor. So this was phase 2, the next 3 years of a study. So here, if we look at nitrous oxide, which is one of the losses, we see we're losing just under 2 kilograms of N per hectare. Not a lot that's agronomically important, but it is important from the atmosphere. If we add just a urease inhibitor, unfortunately, our losses increase. But the dual inhibitor, our losses decreased. When we go from pre-plant to side dress, so we're delaying it from applying all the nitrogen at front to maybe applying 30 kilograms at front and then another 160 or so at side dress, we had a 28% reduction into emissions just by delaying it, or 34% if we add the dual inhibitors. But like we saw in the pre-plant, urease alone, unfortunately, increases N2O emissions. So we want to, in this study, really shows that the dual inhibitor is the way to go. And in fact, here we look at the pre-plant versus side dress. We see roughly a 14% increase in yields, and are, just by delaying from pre-plant to side dress. Our inhibitors weren't as effective in this particular study as we've seen in others, and I will show you some other examples. But just the point here is, by delaying, we've avoided some early season losses, and that has allowed for a 14% increase in yields. So the next sort of version, as I said, I couldn't do all these different comparisons at once. We also have seen that the injection has worked very well. And I thought, okay, how can we increase injection efficiency even more? And I'll show you slides for this to show you what I'm describing. But in this particular study, we're comparing 3 different nitrogen placements, either broadcasting the urea, or a single slot or a double slot application. I'll show you what that means. And again, we wanted to look at these 3 enhanced efficiency fertilizers: no fertilizer, urease inhibitor, or a dual inhibitor. So here's our broadcasting urea, which it sort of is very sort of a common practice that you can very quickly get the nitrogen on the soil. Single slot injection, where we're putting a injection slot between slot between the corn rows. Now here we've offset it a bit so the comparison with double slot is compared. But here, so now instead of having 1 injection slot with the nitrogen, we have 2. Now what we're doing is we're adding the same amount of nitrogen with all these 3 treatments. Why are we looking at the double slot injection? If you recall, what happens especially with UAN or the urea in UAN, what happens there is that as the urea, or in straight broadcast urea or UAN injection, as it hydrolyzes, pH goes up. Now, if we add half of the amount of nitrogen in each slot, there's not going to be as much urea hydrolyzing each slot, so the pH won't go up as high. And so with it not going up as high, then the ammonium losses should be lower. So the idea is, by having 2 slots, you're splitting the amount of the nitrogen so that you're trying to reduce the losses by having less concentrated zone of fertilizer in each of those slots. And I'll show you what we've found from this particular study. Now, when we take these measurements, a lot of data is collected. Here we have all our wind tunnels in our field. We deploy them the day of application. Within a few hours of side dressing the field. We haul these in. We've got a whole bunch of students and staff doing it. And we start measuring ammonium loss on a daily basis every day, including weekends, for 28 days. So I'm not going to worry about these lines because I'll show you the summary graph, but just showing you a lot of data is used to collect the amount of ammonium that goes through these tunnels and how much ammonium is actually comes off the soil over the period. Like here, we had a bit of, it was very dry, then we had some rain events. So we start seeing a peak in ammonium emissions, but by 28 days, it sort of comes back to background level. If you add cumulative ammonium, we see treatment differences. In particular, if you look at single slot UAN injection, we have higher ammonium losses, 17 kilograms in per hectare. And just by adding the inhibitors, we're able to reduce it down to 3. Or if we went to double injection, we've also reduced losses. If you look at the summary over a 2-year period, here's ammonium volatilization loss, averaged about 13 kilograms. We can reduce it 72% just by adding a dual inhibitor. We reduce it 23% with a single slot injection and by 97% with a double slot. I'm sorry, 23% single slot, 97% with the single slot and the dual inhibitors. We also saw fairly effective reduction with the double slot alone with no inhibitors of 65% or 84% with the 2 inhibitors. So it shows that double slot does work to decrease losses, but having the double slot and the inhibitors or single slot and the inhibitors is also a practice by sort of, building on or stacking some practices. N2O emissions were measured. We measured them over a 6-month period. These are always highest after nitrogen is applied. And we have, if you look at the top graph, those are the rain events, amount of precipitation that we get. And when we have high rain events, the soil becomes wet, and that process called denitrification kicks in. The microbes convert some of the nitrate to N2O, which is lost from the soils. And here we can see all the different treatment differences. Typically, we collect about 20,000 gas samples per year to estimate the losses. And here is the cumulative losses if we add the losses up, every day over the season. And for time constraints, I'll just show you the summary. So over a 3-year period, we actually lost over 7 kilograms of nitrogen with a single slot. We're able to decrease that by 16%, which is the green bar, when we added the dual inhibitor. We also able to decrease it by 16% just by going from single slot to double slot. But what's really neat is that if we look at double slot and the dual inhibitor, which is the green bar here, we have a 53% reduction in N2O loss. What's curious here is that broadcast urea also has very low losses. And, the reason why that occurred is that broadcast urea had so much ammonium volatilization occurring that there wasn't a lot of nitrogen left in the soil for other losses to occur. So that sort of helps to explain what's going on with there. So what happens with yields? Here's our broadcast treatments. 8.5 tons. We got a slightly higher yield with single slot, but we had 7 to 13% higher yield with the double slot. So the double slot not only decreased the ammonium loss and N2O loss, but we also had dramatically greater yields with this particular treatment. Okay, 2 more phases to go through just to explain. So this is a cooperative study with Josh at the University of Guelph. And here we are comparing just late season application. We're adding it, when the corn is, 5 or 6 feet tall, 2 meters, looking at broadcast urea versus surface application of UAN, looking at with just N fertilizer or N fertilizer with urea's inhibitor. So late in the season, you don't need the nitrification inhibitor at that point. And what we found with that particular study, here we put wind tunnels to measure ammonium loss. We applied it quite late. Here's a look at the sort of dribbling, 2 dribble lines of UAN. We also have a broadcast urea on there. Really, we applied 130 kilograms and we were losing 55% N loss within 2 weeks. Well, most of it occurred within 2 weeks, but we lost 55% of the N in 2022, or 58%. So it's lost to the air. We're fertilizing the air more than we're fertilizing the soil. And we're able to decrease those losses. That's with the next one, which is the dark red triangle. So with the combination of urease inhibitor, we're able to decrease it, on average about 50%, but we're still getting 40 kilograms lost out of 130 that are applied. And if we had instead dribbled the UAN only contains 50% urea, we have lower losses. And then UAN with the urease inhibitor, the dark green circles, here we only have 21% loss in 2022 and 15% loss in 2023. What does it do with yield? So I had a study right beside it where we just did normal applications. Here's broadcast urea with 2 inhibitors. UAN, again, we usually see injected UAN doing better than broadcast, a 3% yield increase. UAN with a dual inhibitor, 13% yield increase. All our late application, we added the same amount of nitrogen, but we added it later in the season, and we had anywhere between a 7.5 to 10% yield loss. So why is this occurring? For multiple reasons. One of which is you can see these plants by delaying it. They're already, light green. They're already nitrogen deficient, and it's almost too late by allowing it to go to this, V10 to V13 stage. It's already missed the opportunity to make most use of the fertilizer. That's one aspect. The other aspect is surface application late in the season. If we don't get a lot of rain after that application, that nitrogen stays the surface, and a lot of your roots are much lower and may not have access to that surface end. So it's fine if you have late season, then it happens to have a lot of rain to move some of the nitrogen in the soil. But if it stays at the surface, it may not be available to your crop. At the end of the day, late application clearly did not pay off. So lastly, this is sort of the research trials, and then I'll give you an example of the living lab results. Here we want to say, okay, we've already learned a lot about different enhanced efficiency fertilizers in fairly simple systems, but what if you add cover crops to the system? So here we have a comparison between no cover crop and a cereal rye cover crop. And we looked at either just regular N fertilizer or one with dual inhibitors. And so here's a look at side dressing. You can see the corn coming through in this terminated rye cover crop. It's sprayed out usually about a week or so before planting, but we don't really have an emergence problem here. Here's a picture of it later in the season where the corn's doing very well. So we're comparing that to the no rye cover crop in an adjacent plot. You could see here any of the controls with lower N rates. They're all paled out if you can see the drone image. And actually you'll see some of the urea treatments didn't do so well with a cover crop. And I'll explain that next couple slides. So here, let's start looking at ammonium volatilization. So the period between 21 to 23 had very high ammonium losses. Here we had 50 kilograms of N lost out of about 160 applied. So it's about a third of the N was lost. Here's broadcast urea. These first 4 bars are the bare soils with no cover crop. So just by going broadcast urea with the 2 inhibitors, we are able to decrease ammonium losses by 43%. But when we inject, we were able to decrease loss by 95%. Injecting with these urease nitrification inhibitor, it's close to 100% decrease in losses. Now, if you look at the next set of bars, same sort of treatments, broadcast urea, no inhibitor with inhibitor, injected, no inhibitor with inhibitor. just having that rye cover crop present has helped to decrease some of the losses as well. So we have a 19% lower loss, or it's up to 63% lower loss compared to broadcast urea, and 100% reduction in losses compared to the broadcast urea. So having the cover crop also seems to help reduce ammonium volatilization losses. In terms of N2O emissions, here we see that N2O emissions with the dual inhibitors with injected UAN were 33% lower than not having those ureas and NHK inhibitors. We also see broadcast urea having very low N2O emissions because there's less N in the soil because of all the high ammonium loss. We see that also with the rye cover crop. But the combination of the rye cover crop also itself decreased N2O emissions. And that combination of the rye injected and the dual inhibitors, we had a 35% reduction in loss. Here are the chambers that we're using to measure N2O emissions throughout the growing season. So corn grain yields, as we've seen in many studies before, slight benefit with the dual inhibitors and broadcast urea, probably about a 3% yield increase. 6% just by injecting versus broadcasting, same N rate, but it's just more efficient because there's less ammonium loss. But the combination of injecting with inhibitors, our yield increases by 16%, which clearly pays for itself. In terms of the rye cover crop data, I've sort of hidden this initially because I want to take some time to explain it. So if you broadcast urea on the surface and you have a rye cover crop, we had a yield decrease. So what's going on there? So basically, that rye residue is going to decompose. It has a high CN ratio. The microbes will take the fertilizer and help decompose the rye. When it does that, that nitrogen is not available to the corn, so we have an N deficiency occurring. We've overcome that if we reduce losses with the dual inhibitor, but we still see the yield loss. We're able to compensate for that growing the rye cover crop by putting the nitrogen in the soil at about 3 inches or 7.5 centimeters. By putting it below that decomposition zone, it's now available to the plant roots. So we also see the yield benefit of injecting even when there's cover crop present. So story is, if you have a cover crop, you want to inject rather than broadcast because you'll provide access of the nitrogen to the corn as opposed to the microbes that are decomposing the cover crop. I'm going to finish off by just a couple of examples from nitrogen management trials that were run for the Living Lab last year. And the questions that we're asking, can we manage our nitrogen to reduce losses and increase N uptake in crop yields? And can we manage nitrogen practices to reduce N2O emissions? And ultimately, which N management practices are most effective? Now, on the Living Lab trials, as was mentioned earlier, the ones that we use for greenhouse gas monitoring are described here. We've got one near Harrow, one up in Kent County, sort of central Ontario. There's 3 that are near the, between Ottawa or up closer to Pembroke, one Peterborough. I'm going to show results from 2 of the different studies. Here we have one in Harrow. So the yields were a little over 240, about 241 bushels per acre. We added these were all injected UAN with dual inhibitor, a 9 bushel increase. Here we have a case where we've dropped the nitrogen rate by 15%. So we're 85% of the N rate, 155 bushels per acre instead of the 180. We actually have a 9.5 bushel decrease. Obviously not. N is limited, and this isn't something we want to encourage. However, what was really neat was at the 85% N rate, by having the inhibitors and reducing losses, we actually had a 15 bushel increase compared to UAN 85%, or 5 bushel increase over UAN. If we look at the profitability, based upon, $6 per bushel corn, the cost of the inhibitors and whatnot, we have a $34 per acre profit with the UAN and the dual inhibitors. We have a loss if we just decrease nitrogen rate without actually adding the inhibitors. But the combination of the savings of nitrogen going to the 155 versus 180 bushels, so we've saved nitrogen fertilizer, we've increased yields, so there's that in terms of gross profit be $43 per acre profit with going with the 85% rate with the dual inhibitors. So it can pay. Here's another study at Ilderton where these are all broadcast treatments. It's either urea at 190, urea with ESN, so it's a coated product that's solar release. It's 50% of the nitrogen was coated, 50% regular urea. Next one was urea with the dual inhibitors at 190. All three, these first treatments were 190, whereas the last treatment was 20% lower N rates. And we see that all the treatments had a yield increase compared to urea between 8 to 11 bushels. And if we look at the profitability of these, there was a $31 per acre benefit with using ESN, with using inhibitors at the higher rate, the 190, a $41 per acre benefit. But by dropping the N rate, we've saved on some of the fertilizer by dropping the N rate by 20%. And by reducing losses, we saw a $94 per acre. Now, this is just based upon last year's data. We really do need more seasons. But at first glance and first look, it can work in some situations. We also, this is a third study where we are actually measuring N2O losses. UAN, when you have the two inhibitors, a 41% reduction in loss. Here we reduced the N rate by 85%, and we had a 61% reduction in N2O loss. But a combination of lower rate and inhibitors, 85% reduction in N2O losses, which is a really good thing in terms of keeping more nitrogen in the soil and having lower agronomic impacts to the environment. So what did we find from the, just really from last year's living lab trials? We can't look at all the combinations I can in my field studies, but we sort of tried to choose a couple of the treatments that were more interesting to the farmers that we thought could be effective. And we saw an average of 9 bushel increase with the inhibitors at the 180 pound rate for the Harrow site, and a 15 bushel per acre increase with inhibitors at 155 pound, the 85% rate. In Ilderton, we had a 10 bushel increase with the inhibitors at the 190 rate. Nitrous oxide emission reductions, it varied at the Tilbury site anywhere from 41% with just the use of inhibitors, 61% with reducing rate, or 68% with lower rate and the inhibitors. So what I've tried to sort of cover over the last, 40 or so minutes is looking at this whole pipe and valve concept and showing the nitrogen management strategies, the 4R strategies, whether it's, better placement, side dressing, and adding the dual inhibitors. All these things can be helpful to decrease losses. I realize that you can't do all those different practices on any one farm, so you have to choose. There's a lot of options here. Choose the ones that make the most sense for your farm operation. Also, conservation ag, I showed you an example of cover crops. I have other example, which I didn't show because of time constraints, where I looked at, for instance, zone till versus conventional till. And zone till, a conservation tillage treatment had lower N2O losses as well and higher carbon in the soils. So it's trying to look at a comprehensive approach you can use. You could tailor and pick and choose which nitrogen management practices fit your operation. And again, with proper crop rotations, cover crops, conservation tillage, those are other factors that can also reduce losses as well. And at the end of the day, if you're reducing losses, you're increasing crop yields. So take-home messages, we found that side dress application, we were able to avoid some of those early season N2O emissions. The combination of ureas and nitrification inhibitors in many of these studies found to be effective when they're used together because they can reduce both ammonium volatilization losses as well as nitrous oxide emissions. And at the end of the day, result in increased crop yields because there's more nitrogen available to the crops. Improved end placement, dual injection system reduces the urea concentration each band. So it reduces ammonium losses, increases nitrogen availability and crop yields. So placing nitrogen is better than surface application if you have that option on your farm system. And as I mentioned before, conservation ag practices can help improve soil carbon from cover crops. Diverse crop rotations, especially ones, where you have like a cereal crop like wheat in them. Conservation tillage, whether it's zone till or another conservation tillage, all these factors can help your soil increase carbon and do better especially under adverse weather conditions, whether it be droughts or excess rain, and at the end of the day, help reduce N losses and provide more N to your crops. There's been a lot of studies, a lot of research going on over the years, so I do want to appreciate all the funding organizations that have helped us over the years, and also all the various Living Lab and trial cooperators who have allowed us to work with them to try to come up with systems that would be tailored to their farmer operation, and hopefully it'll be benefit to them as well. And I'll end it there with a thank you, and I guess open it up to questions if there are any.
Yeah, we got a few questions that came through. Some of them I feel your slides further on has answered those, so maybe we'll just do a quick summary of those questions from the data you pulled in later. The first was, and this is you spoke earlier, is that I'm hearing from several fertilizer dealer agronomists that farmers are opting for urease only inhibitor treatment to save money while getting the most of the benefit from inhibitor treatment of urea. Does that make agronomic economic sense?
Okay. It depends upon how the nitrogen is applied and when it is applied, right? So if it's applied early in the season, whether it's at planting or at side dress, then you really want to include a nitrification inhibitor as well, because we know that, upwards of 8 or 10 kilograms of N2O could be lost if it's not there. What we're not measuring is whatever N2O is lost, N2 is also lost as well. So you could be losing 20% of your N if you don't have a nitrification inhibitor. I guess the exception where I would suggest not using it is if you go to very late application where it's the V10, V13 stage, there you actually want nitrification to occur quickly so that nitrogen can leach in the soil. So in that application, yes, a urease inhibitor alone may work. However, as I've shown, that application, because you've missed that opportunity of N uptake earlier on the season, you can actually look at 7 to 10% yield decrease. So at the end of the day, I really recommend that both a urease and a nitrification inhibitor be applied together, because both ammonium and N2O can be lost, and both those losses can impact crop yields.
There was a question asking about the yield benefit to the addition of inhibitors at side dress time. I think the kind of mentioning whether the graphs seem to say there was no yield benefit or.
No. Okay. So as you saw, there were about 5 different sort of phases of the study. And in most cases, we do see a yield benefit with inhibitors. Now, I'm sort of cautioning that if you have a year where you're incorporating the nitrogen, if you have a year where you have a little bit of rain, gradually throughout the season, but you're not inundated with an inch or two of rain at any one time. So there are indeed some years where losses may be low, but we've seen more often than not that losses do occur, and you know, 8 out of 10 times it's worthwhile to add the inhibitors, and we have seen yield benefits in most of the studies, not all, but in most.
Is there any data on NH3 losses, comparison between timing of application?
Okay. So NH3 losses basically are related to many factors. So you're talking about ammonium volatilization. So the hotter the temperature is when you apply it, and the windier the conditions, the higher the loss, right? So what you want to do is really to avoid ammonium volatilization, you want to do two things. If you're going to add it as a broadcast treatment, then you really need to include a urease inhibitor along with it. Otherwise, you can get up to 50% loss. If you inject it, okay, then losses are dramatically decreased. So again, it does depend a little bit upon the weather. I didn't really go into this, but another thing that can occur even with injection is you really want to have some sort of a packing wheel or closing wheel to make sure that injection slot is covered over. Because if you're talking about timing, if you, let's say, inject as a side dress and you don't close that slot very well, and we have dry condition, that slot can actually open up, and we can have losses if you don't have the dual inhibitor there. So yes, timing can impact losses, but it's more a function of the day and the conditions where you're applying it. By incorporating, by adding the dual inhibitors that contain the urease inhibitor in particular, you're able to decrease ammonium loss considerably.
Perfect. Someone asked about urease activity and potential ammonia loss with cover cropping residue, which you did speak on. So just kind of with given time, I was going to go into the next cover cropping question, which was how much more N do we need to apply to overcome the rye decomposition effect?
Well, yes. Okay. So what you want to do, you could there's two approaches. One is you could apply more N. And then some of that N would be involved with the decomposition of the rye residue so that your corn isn't impacted. But my preferred way of going is not to apply more N, but just make sure that it's, especially under sort of a no-till or conservation tillage system, that you put the N below that high density root mat or those top 2 inches. And to me, that's sort of the way of going is it's more about placement to avoid that immobilization. By immobilization, I'm talking about the conversion of the fertilizer into the microbial N to decompose the cover crop. So it's more about placement. I think the key there is to put it below the active decomposition zone. Otherwise, yes, you may have to add another 30 kilograms of N to compensate for that. But I still prefer to look at placement rather than increasing rates, because increasing rates also means later on you're going to have more losses of N2O as an example.
There was a question on if there were studies on negative impacts of adding the inhibitors as like the accumulation of chemicals within the soil.
Yeah, so like one of the things, let me just sort of talk about nitrification inhibitors to start with. some of the products contain an education inhibitor DCD, and DCD basically, as it decomposes, ends up as CO2 and ammonium. So there really isn't any impact of that product, within 3 or 4 weeks after application. Urease inhibitors as well. I'm not aware of any long-term studies that have negative impacts. So far, it looks like they are safe. But having said that, I haven't specifically looked at that as part of the research. But from doing research reviews in the literature, I have not come across any negative impacts of these inhibitors. They generally break down and are effective for about 3 or 4 weeks, but at the end of the season are pretty well out of the soil and a non-issue. A great question.
And then the same person had an additional question. In terms of agronomy, it appears that N loss through NH3 volatilization is many times greater than the loss of N2O emission.
True.
Why is there not much attention paid to NH3 losses in research than in N2O emission?
I think that's also a good question. And the reason being is that not very many researchers have taken the effort to build wind tunnels and measure ammonium loss. Now, having said that, there is a new semi-quantitative technique. So it won't give you as accurate measurements, but there's also a Dossi tube method that you can look at treatment differences. It's basically putting a bucket over a stake with a indicator that's tied to the stake. But I think it's more a case that it's the funding. It's a combination of many things. It's really all about instrumentation. And right now, not a lot of people have built or have used wind tunnels. I think that's going to be increasing because the other aspect that I didn't mention, I mentioned how, let me just put myself back in the center here. I mentioned how N2O can affect the climate, but what I didn't really talk about is the impacts of the ammonium loss. So ammonium, when it comes out of the soil, through ammonium volatilization from fertilizers, it can also come out from manure addition. You can often smell the ammonium after manure is applied on the surface. The ammonium that comes out of there reacts with very fine particles. They're called PM2.5, particulate matter, 2.5 microns. So they're very small particles, and those are the precursors of smog. So with it being precursors of smog, it can impact people with respiratory issues, the elderly, young babies, and so forth. So there are also health concerns with ammonium loss as well.
Try to just because it's 1 o'clock, so we'll try to finish up with a couple questions. Craig, if it's okay with you, I'll just show the QR code just in case anyone needs to get off at 1 o'clock.
Certainly.
And then just share that. That looks okay.
Yeah, I can see it.
Now I just gotta find the chat. There we are. There's a question about timing for Y drop. What leaf is the optimal time to Y drop or broadcast N in row?
Okay. Well, I've only really looked at Y drop sort of at one time, and I really, unfortunately, was not impressed with it. That's where we saw the 7 to 10% yield decrease. What I rather find consistently is side dressing at sort of the 5 or 6 leaf stage. That period is basically a month after planting, so you've avoided the early season rains and some of the losses. To me, that's the time to shoot if you have the ability to side dress. I mean, at the end of the day, I recommend if you have the ability, it's better to side dress than pre-plant. it's better to incorporate than add as broadcast, and it's better to add inhibitors than no inhibitors. That's sort of, at the end of the day, the take-home message.
Perfect. And then there's some questions about, are you able to decrease your N rate with Amidas versus straight urea?
Okay, I haven't used that product, but I imagine, any products with the dual inhibitors, we've seen that we could decrease the rate by about 15% and have it as a profitable scenario. We showed that with some of the data in the living lab sites where, the most profitable treatment was one with in the two farms, one with in one case 15% lower N rate with the dual inhibitors, or in the second case was a 20% lower rate with the dual inhibitors. So yes, if you can decrease losses, you could probably back off your N rate by 15 to 20%. And, from a profitability standpoint, with the lower cost of fertilizer, with the additional cost of the inhibitor, and the usually higher yields, it clearly pays for itself and is the way to go.
Sorry, I get all the emails every time someone submits a keyword submission, so I was trying not to get it ringing through. There's a question about applying 28 by side dress. Does rainfall shortly after affect the N loss, both with an inhibitor or not?
Okay, so rainfall after 28%, it can impact N2O losses in particular. So if we have the soil become saturated, so if it's too wet for machinery to go on, yes, you can have N2O losses if in fact you have not added an inhibitor. But if you've added an inhibitor, then the nitrogen stays in the ammonium form longer, and ammonium isn't converted to N2O, it has to convert to nitrate first. So yes, a rainfall after injection can result in N2O losses, in particular if a nitrification inhibitor isn't included.
Yeah, we'll do a couple more questions before we end it. So this is kind of speaking to Amidas again. In your research when you broadcast, is that all at planting or later in the season? For example, V6 corn. The plan on my farm would be to apply Amidas likely next week. Am I under the impression that coating the Amidas with agritane would be advisable? Also, is it safe to assume that N is lost? The S in Amidas is also lost, the sulfur?
Yeah, you know what? I haven't specifically worked with Amidas, so I can't answer directly. However, if that person wants to contact me directly, I can certainly look it up and answer it by email. My email address is really first name, last name, so craig.drury@agr.gc.ca. Yeah, give me a shout. I can look it up. I'm just not, there's so many different products available. I'm just not familiar enough with me just to comment.
I guess I'll do a kind of final type research question. One person's asking, was your data mostly collected on clay soils?
Yes, so the data that I was showing you for the research trials was on clay soils, but the soils for the living lab sites varied. They went from sort of a sandy loam texture. There's some that are on silt, some on clay. So the living lab sites vary. And we've also are working with a number of other researchers and modelers where there's a greater soil texture covered. In particular, I'm doing some collaborative studies with Claudia Wagner-Riddle at the University of Guelph, and a lot of the soils at Aurora, for instance, are more of a silt loam. But to answer the question, most of the research trials We're on the clay loam soils, but the living lab trials, they do vary. You're on mute. Still on mute.
Oh, my apologies. I was going to say, I think due to timing, we'll leave the questions there. But if you do have additional questions, my colleague Kelly has left Craig's email, as well as please feel free to email research as well, and we can find answers for you as well through speaking with Craig. I want to thank Craig again. Kelly, if you had any words to say as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I thank you so much, Craig, for giving us this great presentation, addressing greenhouse gas mitigations, but also giving farmers a lot of confidence with beneficial management practices. This video will be available on the Living Labs website in the coming weeks and also on the YouTube channel. So if anybody wants to go back over any of the data, it will be available and I will send it out. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Craig, for spending your lunch hour with us, and I hope everyone stays cool in this heat.
Take care.
Bye now.